Hello, and welcome to Psychology 111. In this presentation, we will continue our look at cognition. As you will recall, cognition is the use of mental abilities to process information. One mental ability that we often apply to information is reasoning. Reasoning is the act of using mental powers to derive a belief from given information. That is, it is interpreting information in order to come up with an opinion. If that opinion is supported by the information, then it is said to be valid. If the opinion isn't supported by the information, then it is said to be invalid. For example, if you use the information that it snows in Fargo to form the belief that it snows in North Dakota, then this would be valid. But if you use the information that it snows in Fargo to form the belief that it snows in Alabama, then this would be invalid. The process of drawing valid beliefs is known as logic. There are many ways of deriving a belief from information. One type of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is using specific examples to formulate broad rules. It is generalizing. For example, if you formed the belief that all octopuses have suckered tentacles based on the fact that every octopus you have ever seen has had suckered tentacles, then you would be using inductive reasoning. Logical induction produces assumptions that are quite likely to be true, but are never 100% certain. For example, it is quite likely to be true that all octopuses have suckered tentacles, because no one has ever seen an octopus with suckerless tentacles. However, we can't be 100% certain, because there might be rare suckerless tentacle octopuses somewhere in the hidden depths of the ocean that no one has ever seen. Another type of reasoning is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is using general knowledge to draw specific conclusions. It is inferring. For example, if we use the general knowledge that only mammals have warm blood and that cows have warm blood to infer that cows must be mammals, then we would be using deductive reasoning. Logical deduction produces conclusions that are certain to be true, provided that the general knowledge is correct. For example, it is true that only mammals have warm blood, and it is true that cows have warm blood. So it is 100% certain that cows must be mammals. A third type of reasoning is abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is using available information to come up with the most likely conclusion. For example, if we know that Akira's house was burgled, and we know that her TV was found in her neighbor's garage, then it is most likely that her neighbor is the thief. We cannot be absolutely certain of this. The TV might have been planted in the garage, but it is very probable. A fourth type of reasoning is hypothesis testing. As you know, a hypothesis is an assumption. It is an idea that proposes a tentative explanation for something. Hypothesis testing involves searching for evidence in order to establish whether such assumptions are true or not. There are two strategies of evidence gathering that people can adopt. One strategy is verification, also known as confirmation. Verification involves searching for evidence that supports your assumption. Verification is a very inefficient way to test hypotheses. For example, if you saw an unusual animal in your garden and you formed the hypothesis that it was a herbivore, you could test this assumption by leaving out different plant matter each night to see whether it eats it. Doing all of this would take days, and even if the animal ate all the different plant matters, it wouldn't be absolute proof that the animal, in this case an Australian possum, was a herbivore. The other strategy is falsification, which involves searching for evidence that disproves your assumption. Falsification is a very efficient way of testing hypotheses. For example, if you form the hypothesis that the animal was a herbivore, you could very quickly test this in one single go by leaving out some mealworms. If you found that the animal ate them, then you would know with complete certainty that the animal is not a herbivore. This seems quite obvious. However, confirmation bias is actually very common in people. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for and give more weight to evidence that affirms one's preconceptions. Once we hold an opinion, we tend to look for and pay attention to evidence that supports that opinion and avoid or ignore evidence that contradicts that opinion. We do this because none of us likes to be wrong. There are many factors that can influence our reasoning. One factor that can influence reasoning is instruction. People are not born logical. Reasoning skills are learned, so the more formal training we have in logic, the better we are at reasoning. For example, reasoning problems like the one I've shown are quite difficult for the uninitiated. However, if you have been taught about Euler diagrams, a pictorial means of showing the relationship between sets, then finding the solution to such reasoning tasks is quite easy. A second factor that can influence reasoning is belief bias. Belief bias is the tendency to accept a weak argument's conclusion if that conclusion seems believable, or reject a strong argument's conclusion if that conclusion seems unbelievable. For example, the argument shown is quite weak, but many people overlook the weakness of the argument because the conclusion happens to match their own opinion. The conclusion seems very believable to them, so they ignore how the conclusion was arrived at. People are willing to accept a weak argument's conclusion if that conclusion matches their own opinion, because no one likes to think that their opinions are groundless. A third factor that can influence reasoning is the content material. The subject matter under consideration influences our reasoning abilities. We are better about reasoning about concrete or touchable items than we are about abstract, intangible notions. The more familiar we are with content material, the better we are at reasoning about it. And we are particularly adept at reasoning about social contracts. Social contracts are agreements made between people. These tendencies are revealed in the following exercises. The Wason selection task involves cards that have a number on one side and a letter on the other. You are told that the law is, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it must have an even number on the other. You are then dealt 4 cards with A, D, 4 and 7 face upwards and asked, which card or cards do you need to turn over to see if the law is being broken? In this version of the Wason selection task, the content material is abstract. Letters and numbers are not tangible, touchable things. We are unfamiliar with any rules to do with vowels and even numbers. And the law is not about an agreement made between people. This version is very difficult to solve. The correct answer is A and 7, because these are the only cards that could possibly break the rule. If the A has an odd number on the other side, then this would break the rule. And if the 7 has a vowel on the other side, then this would break the rule. It doesn't matter what is on the other side of the D and the 4 cards. This becomes obvious when you change the content of the task. In this version of the Wason selection task, the content material is concrete. Beer and Coke are touchable things. We are familiar with rules to do with drinking age. And the law is about an agreement made between people. This version of the task is very easy to solve. The answer is beer and 17, because someone under 21 drinking beer would break the law, and someone 17 drinking beer would also break the law. It is not possible to break the law by drinking Coke, and it is not possible to break the law if you are over 21. We are better at reasoning about concrete, touchable things than abstract, intangible notions, because being able to visualize things in a physical form gives us greater insight into the structure of the problem. We find it easier to understand the problem. We are better at reasoning about familiar material because previous contact allows us to draw on our experience of solving problems in similar situations, and practice makes perfect. It is speculated that the reason we are particularly adept at reasoning about social contracts is that we have evolved to be able to spot cheaters. Being able to identify people who reneged on deals helped our ancestors to survive. And so the genes linked to this ability have been passed on. Another mental ability that we can apply to the processing of information is judgment and decision making. Judgment involves forming opinions. For example, how much do I like Harry, or how much do I like Claire? While decision-making involves choosing between alternatives. For example, do I choose to hang out with Harry, or do I choose to hang out with Claire? There are two approaches that people can take to judgment and decision-making. One method is optimizing. Optimizing is reaching the best possible judgment or decision. It involves collecting and considering all relevant information. For example, if you wanted to pick the biggest apple on a tree, you would have to measure every single one before making your choice. Often, in real-life situations, it is impossible to gather all the relevant information. Also, in some situations, our minds are not powerful enough to think about all the relevant information. And in addition, sometimes we don't have enough time to think about all the relevant information. In such circumstances, people cannot optimize, so instead they satisfice. Satisfice is a portmanteau word meaning to satisfy and to suffice. That is, people come up with a good enough decision. For example, if you wanted to buy the best possible pair of sneakers, you would have to find out all the details of every style of sneaker in the world, their price, their quality, their looks, etc., and compare them on all of these criteria. This would be almost impossible. So instead, you could choose a good enough pair by relying on a heuristic. Heuristics are methods of arriving at satisfactory solutions with modest amounts of thinking. They are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb. For example, when choosing sneakers, you could rely on the rule of thumb: if they fit and look good and they cost less than $70, then I will buy them. Research into heuristics has its roots in the work of Kahneman and Tversky. In 1974, they identified 3 heuristics that people typically rely on when making decisions. Since that time, dozens of other heuristics have been researched. The first heuristic that Kahneman and Tversky described was the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic involves basing judgments on how easily information can be brought to mind. For example, if asked, are there more sparrows or more eagles in America, you wouldn't actually know the population numbers for each species, but you could come up with a good enough answer by remembering that you have seen tens of thousands of sparrows, but only hundreds of eagles. The availability heuristic is generally useful. Most of the time, you will come up with a correct answer by using it. However, sometimes it will let you down. For example, with this question, it is unlikely that you know the death rates associated with these events, but you might remember seeing lots of shark attacks. They feature heavily in movies and on YouTube, but very few instances of falling airplane debris. So you might conclude that death by shark attack is more common. However, this would be incorrect. This demonstrates that the availability heuristic fails when our memory or imagination doesn't reflect reality. A second heuristic is the representativeness heuristic. The representativeness heuristic involves basing judgments on how typical something appears to be. For example, in this description, it is unlikely that you know how many Alexanders and Alexandrias there are. So it is unlikely that you know the actual probability that Alex is male or female. But the description sounds more typically male than female. So it is a reasonable guess that Alex is male. Again, the representative heuristic is generally useful. Using it will usually result coming up with the correct answer. After all, as the saying goes, if something looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. However, in some circumstances, the representativeness heuristic will let you down. For example, in this description, Neil sounds much more like the typical airline pilot than the typical construction worker. So you might be tempted to guess that Neil is more likely to be an airline pilot. However, this would be ignoring the fact that there are millions of construction workers in the world, but only a few thousand airline pilots. So it is much more likely that Neil is a construction worker. This demonstrates that the representativeness heuristic fails when people ignore basic probability. A third heuristic is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. The anchoring and adjustment heuristic involves basing judgments on alterations to an original starting point. For example, in this instance, you don't know the price of a 3-bedroom apartment, but if a 4-bedroom apartment in a block is worth $200,000, then it would be reasonable to estimate that a 3-bedroom would be slightly lower. In this case, you would be arriving at your judgment of, say, $175,000 by adjusting the starting point of $200,000. Once more, the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is generally useful. Most times, if you use the heuristics, your estimate will not be far wrong. However, sometimes the heuristic will let you down. For example, in these instances, you might be tempted to think that an estimate of 5 founder members seems low, so adjust your guess upwards to about 15. Or you might think that an estimate of 200 countries in Africa seems high, so adjust your guess downwards to about 175. However, this would be ignoring the fact that the other student doesn't know the answers. The student's estimates of 5 and 200, your anchors, are just guesses. They shouldn't influence your estimate at all. There were in fact 51 founder members of the United Nations, and there are in fact 54 countries in Africa. This illustrates that the anchoring and adjustment heuristic fails when people use irrelevant anchors. That is, when they use senseless starting points. A final topic to be covered in this presentation is the framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive bias where people's choice between alternatives is influenced more by how the information is worded than by the information itself. People like options that appear to offer gains, and they dislike options that appear to offer losses. For example, people are much more likely to buy condoms if they are described as having a 95% success rate than if they are described as having a 5% failure rate, even though they are essentially the same thing.